The cold wind blew across the quiet suburban street as Walt Kowalski sat in the driver's seat of his prized Gran Torino, parked just across from the house he had lived in for years. It was a house that had seen more than its fair share of history. Walt, now a hardened war veteran, wasn't easily rattled. But tonight, something felt different. Something was off. Dear listeners, before we move forward, please subscribe my channel to hit 1,000 figure. He had seen the young gang members in his neighborhood before, roaming around like they owned the place. They were part of a larger problem that had been festering for too long, a problem that Walt couldn't ignore any longer. His quiet life was about to come to a head. The tension in the air was thick. Walt's eyes narrowed as he saw Thao, the quiet, shy boy who had been trying to escape the clutches of the gang, walking hesitantly up to the house. The boy's fear was palpable, and Walt could see it from a distance. But it wasn't just fear for himself. It was fear for his family. The gang, led by the ruthless and arrogant leader, knew no boundaries. Thao had tried to stand up to them, but now they were coming for him. Walt knew the gang wouldn't stop, not until they had broken Thao completely. And Walt wasn't going to let that happen, not on his watch. His old instincts kicked in, the soldier in him awakening. But this time there would be no guns blazing, no reckless violence. He had a different plan. He reached for his cigarette lighter and flicked it open, lighting a cigarette, the red glow lighting his weathered face. It was a symbol of the quiet resolve inside him. As the cigarette burned, he looked towards Thao, now standing nervously near the corner of his house, unaware of what was about to unfold. Walt's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. It wasn't just about protecting Thao anymore. It was about sending a message. He had seen too much, done too much, and now this was going to be his final stand. The scene was set. The gang was coming, and Walt Kowalski would be ready, not with a gun in hand, but with something far more powerful. The sound of distant laughter echoed through the neighborhood, breaking the stillness of the night. Walt could feel the presence of the gang long before they came into view. They were approaching, and Walt had no intention of backing down. His heart didn't race. He had seen too much war, too many conflicts, to let his emotions control him. But there was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet intensity in the way he sat in his Gran Torino. This wasn't just about defending the neighborhood. It was about facing a problem head-on, even if it meant making the ultimate sacrifice. The headlights of a car pierced through the darkness, drawing closer. It was them, the gang. Walt's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The moment of truth was approaching. Walt didn't flinch as the car pulled up next to him, the engine rumbling loudly as the young gang members piled out, swaggering like they owned the place. The leader, a tall, imposing figure with a sneer on his face, was the first to step forward. Behind him, the rest of the gang followed, 6 or 7 young men who had no respect for the neighborhood, for anything but their own power and intimidation. "Hey, old man," the leader called out, his voice dripping with arrogance. "What do you think you're doing, parking in front of my spot?" Walt didn't respond immediately. He simply exhaled a cloud of smoke, his eyes never leaving the gang members. They were baiting him, hoping to provoke a reaction. But Walt wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The leader took a step closer, now standing just a few feet from Walt's window. "What's wrong, old man? Scared of us? Maybe you should just go back inside and mind your own business." His gang snickered in the background, clearly amused by their power over the aging war veteran. Walt's face remained calm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't afraid. He had nothing left to lose, nothing that could break him anymore. All those years of fighting, all the loss, all the regrets, they had built him into something that couldn't be easily intimidated. Then Walt spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "You boys think you can come around here and bully everyone? You think you've got some kind of power?" He took a slow drag from his cigarette, his eyes never leaving the leader. "Well, let me tell you something. I've seen things you wouldn't even understand, and I'm not scared of you." The gang leader chuckled darkly, clearly not expecting this level of resistance from an old man. "Is that right? You think you can stop us? You think you've got the guts?" Walt's response was simple, but powerful. "I don't need guts. I've got something much more powerful." The gang's laughter died down, and, for a brief moment, the street fell into an eerie silence. Walt didn't move. His hands remained steady on the wheel, his eyes locked with the leader's. And then, without warning, he opened the car door slowly, as if inviting them to make their move. His calm demeanor was more unsettling than any anger or aggression. It was the calm before a storm, the silence that precedes the inevitable. The gang members froze. For the first time, they seemed unsure. They hadn't expected the old man to stand his ground. They hadn't expected him to be the one who wasn't afraid. Walt stepped out of the car, towering over them. The leader, still trying to maintain his bravado, took a step back. "You want a fight, old man? We'll give you one," he sneered, but even his voice wavered slightly. Walt didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, he simply stared at them, as if sizing them up. "You don't want this fight," he said softly. "But if you're looking for a reason to end up in the ground, I'm happy to give it to you." The gang leader's smirk faltered, and for a moment, Walt saw something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. The tension was suffocating. This was no longer just about a gang trying to intimidate the neighborhood. This was about Walt Kowalski showing them that there were some things more dangerous than their arrogance. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the leader grinned again, trying to mask his hesitation. "You're crazy, old man," he spat, stepping forward. "We'll see about that." The night grew even colder as the standoff between Walt Kowalski and the gang intensified. The tension in the air felt almost tangible, like a storm ready to break. Walt stood firm, unyielding. The young gang members, their bravado slipping away with each passing second, began to circle him like wolves eyeing their prey. But Walt wasn't just an old man. They could feel it now. There was something in his presence, a calm determination that sent a ripple of uncertainty through the gang. The leader took another step forward, attempting to mask his hesitation with a cocky sneer. "You really think we're gonna let you walk away from this, huh?" He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But deep down, Walt could see the fear creeping into the young man's eyes. He had dealt with this kind of intimidation before, the kind that relied on threats rather than strength. It was something Walt knew how to dismantle. "I don't think you understand," Walt said, his voice cool but firm. "I'm not asking for anything. You're the ones who don't belong here. This isn't your neighborhood." The leader hesitated. For the first time, he looked around at his gang, searching for support. But there was none. They were all staring at Walt, sensing that the old man wasn't just going to back down. There was no fear in him, only a quiet, fierce resolve. The standoff seemed to stretch on forever. The street was eerily silent except for the occasional rustling of the leaves in the wind. Walt didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. The only thing that gave away his readiness was the steady rise and fall of his chest. Then, out of nowhere, one of the gang members, nervous and impulsive, lunged forward, swinging a baseball bat toward Walt. It was too fast, too sudden. Walt's eyes narrowed. Without missing a beat, he took one step back, expertly dodging the swing. His reflexes were sharp, his movements precise, but he didn't retaliate. He didn't need to. "Stop it!" Walt growled, his voice suddenly rising, his command cutting through the night like a blade. "I'm not your enemy." The gang member froze, the bat suspended in midair, his arms shaking. Walt's words hit harder than any physical strike could. He was no longer just a man facing a gang. He was a man standing between the darkness and something better, a beacon of strength in a world that had forgotten its way. The gang leader snarled, stepping forward again. "You've got no clue who you're dealing with," he spat. "We're not scared of you." Walt didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly took a step toward the leader, his face hardening. "You should be." It was then that Walt made his move, but not in the way they expected. With his final words, he didn't reach for a weapon, didn't throw a punch. Instead, he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward them, slowly, deliberately. There was no hesitation in his movements. This was his sacrifice. Walt had already made the decision. It wasn't about violence. It wasn't about winning. It was about showing these young men the consequences of their choices. He was ready to face the ultimate price for it. His life. The gang leader sneered, now furious. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he shouted, before pulling out a gun from his waistband and aiming it directly at Walt. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Walt's eyes never left the leader's, and there was no fear in his gaze, only understanding. He had come to terms with the fact that this was the end. This was his final act, his final stand. Walt's last words echoed through the night, his voice steady, calm. "I'm not a hero. I'm just an old man who's tired of watching this happen." And with that, the shot rang out, cutting through the silence. The shot rang out like a thunderclap in the night. The sound of it echoed down the street, a cruel reminder of the violence that had engulfed the neighborhood. Walt Kowalski, standing alone in the face of a gang that had threatened everything he held dear, crumpled to the ground. The Gran Torino, parked just a few feet away, stood as a silent witness to the final moments of an old man who had given everything for one last act of defiance. For a moment, everything was still. The gang members stood frozen, the weight of their actions sinking in as the leader lowered the gun. His hand trembled, uncertainty flashing across his face as he looked down at Walt's motionless body. The night had taken on a different hue, the tension that had once been so thick now replaced by a heavy silence. Walt had done what he set out to do. His sacrifice had spoken louder than any threat or act of violence ever could. He hadn't gone down fighting with weapons or fists. He had gone down showing them the cost of their choices, a quiet, determined resolve that left the gang members standing in the cold, staring at the consequences of their actions. The leader glanced around nervously. He could feel the weight of Walt's final act in the air. Something had changed. They had expected to intimidate the old man, break him, but instead Walt had forced them to confront their own sins. The gang wasn't the same now. Their power had been shattered, the air around them heavy with guilt and confusion. For Thao, standing just a few yards away, watching the scene unfold, the weight of what had just happened hit him like a freight train. He had always feared the gang, But now he saw them for what they truly were: cowards hiding behind their cruelty, unable to face the truth. And Walt Kowalski, the grizzled old man who had once been nothing but a neighbor to him, had given up his life to show him the way. Thao rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he knelt by Walt's side, feeling the blood already soaking into the ground. The old man's eyes were still open, though his breathing had slowed, each exhale shallow and labored. You didn't have to do this," Thao whispered, his voice shaking. "Why? Why did you—" Walt's lips barely moved, but his eyes locked onto Thao's, and with his final ounce of strength he spoke, his voice ragged but filled with a sense of calm. "Somebody had to. Don't be like them," Walt muttered, his eyes drifting to the gang, now retreating into the shadows, their heads down, their hands trembling. "You're better than this, than they are." Thao could barely hold back the tears as he looked down at the man who had sacrificed everything for him, for the neighborhood, for justice. Walt's last act wasn't one of violence. It was one of redemption. In a world that had long forgotten what it meant to stand up for what was right, Walt had made sure that his death would not be in vain. His words and actions had spoken louder than anything else. The gang members, seeing the boy now kneeling beside the man they had killed, felt an unfamiliar sting of shame. It was as if the old man's death had ripped away the facade of invincibility they had so carefully built. The leader turned away, his face grim, unable to look at what he had just taken from the world. And just like that, the fight was over. Not with a bang, not with a final confrontation, but with a sacrifice, a quiet testament to the strength of one man's will and the power of one final stand. Walt Kowalski had given everything, and in doing so, he had changed the lives of those who remained. The morning after the confrontation, the neighborhood seemed eerily quiet. The sun rose slowly over the streets where once a gang had roamed freely, where violence and fear had been a constant presence. But now, everything was different. The streets, which had witnessed so much turmoil, were finally at peace, though the cost was steep. Thao stood at the corner of the street, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He had watched Walt's death from the shadows, his heart heavy with guilt and confusion. But he also knew something had shifted within him. Walt Kowalski's final act had not only saved him, it had changed his life forever. Thao had always felt like a stranger in his own skin, weighed down by the expectations of his family and the pressures of the gang. But now he was free. The police had arrived shortly after the shooting, and the investigation into Walt's death was underway. The gang members, who had initially fled, had been arrested in the days that followed, their once powerful leader now facing charges that would keep him behind bars for a long time. But that wasn't the part of the story that would linger in the minds of those who had known Walt Kowalski. What would stay with them was his quiet, unwavering courage. In the days that followed, people began to talk about him, not as the grumpy old man who had lived alone on his street, but as the man who had stood up when no one else would. He had made the ultimate sacrifice, not for glory, not for revenge, but for something far greater, the hope that one day the cycle of violence would end and the next generation would learn to live without fear. At Walt's funeral, the church was filled to capacity. People from the neighborhood, even those who had never spoken to him, came to pay their respects. The priest spoke solemnly, but it was the people who knew Walt best who had the most to say. Thao, though still young and grieving, stood in front of the crowd. His voice cracked as he spoke, but there was pride in his words, Walt Kowalski wasn't just an old man. He was the last person who believed this neighborhood still had hope. He taught me what it meant to be a man, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. He showed me that sometimes doing the right thing means making the hardest choices. Thou paused for a moment, looking down at the casket. And that's what Walt did. He made the hard choice. He made the ultimate sacrifice for all of us. The gang, once the terror of the neighborhood, had been dismantled. The community, now united in the wake of Walt's death, began to rebuild. People came together, standing strong against the kind of violence that had taken root. The streets were safer now, but more than that, the spirit of Walt Kowalski lived on in the hearts of those who had witnessed his final stand. The Gran Torino, the car that had come to symbolize Walt's life, was placed in the driveway of the house he had called home. It was a reminder of the man who had driven it through the streets, who had lived and fought with a quiet dignity. A few of the neighbors stopped by, glancing at the car, remembering the man who had given everything for them, for the neighborhood. As the years passed, the story of Walt Kowalski became a legend, a tale passed down from one generation to the next. It wasn't just the story of an old man's death. It was the story of redemption, of sacrifice, and of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. And so, in the quiet of the neighborhood, a lasting peace settled in. The streets, once filled with fear, were now filled with the promise of a better future, thanks to one man's final act of selflessness. Walt Kowalski, the man who had faced a gang and made the ultimate sacrifice, would never be forgotten.